Okay, so this is the last video that is an introduction to what we're going to talk about in this class. So now now that we know how economists think, the sick and twisted way in which we think, we're going to discuss three of the tools that they apply to that thinking. So positive and normative statements, correlation versus causation, and then models. So positive versus normative statements are relatively simple. It's easy to get them confused, but mostly if you're just trying to memorize them, positive is a fact or the way things are. Normative is an opinion about the way things should be. So a lot of times they'll have a should in them. And the way that I keep them straight is that normative has the word norm, like a social norm, like our standards for acceptable behavior. And those are all based on expectations about what should be happening. So normative statements involve an opinion about the way life should be. So an example would be Maine has a minimum wage of $12 an hour. The minimum wage should be higher is normative. Positive statement is just saying what the minimum wage is. So if you were just thinking about economists and your stereotype you have about them, which of these do you think economists tend to emphasize? Do you think economists tend to dwell in the world of positive statements or normative statements? You're not here, so I can't hear what you're saying, and it's not a big enough deal that I want to put a quiz in about it, but I hope you formed your own opinion. I'm going to tell you what I think. I think economists tend to be specialists in positive statements, facts about the way things are. So for example, in my research, if the price of an Alaska salmon permit goes up by $10,000, an extra 10 people will sell their permits and move out of the village. I'm just telling you what my model says will happen if that price goes up. I'm not telling you what should happen. I'm not saying whether people should or shouldn't live in the village where they're born. I try to be value judgment neutral about whether it's good or bad for rural indigenous communities to be destabilized by markets. You can probably tell my personal opinion just by some of the loaded value statements I might make, but I try in my research to be value judgment neutral, to just say this is a fact about what will happen. If policymakers care about these values over those, this is what they might want to do. So just because economists specialize in positive statements doesn't mean that their work is not used to make normative judgments. So a lot of times economic research will inform policymakers' opinions about what should happen. So I want you to try this example just to show you the simplest way you could see me ask you about positive versus normative statements is being able to pick them out. You should be able to pick them out in any newspaper article that you read. So which of these is positive and which are normative? There's only one normative statement. Can you pick it out between A, B, and C? So just pause. This is what I do to tell myself to put the quiz in and pick out the normative statement between the following. This is my favorite tool of economists. I mentioned it on the first day of class. This is what I think about when I think about economics, causation. So, or causality. Correlation is when two events occur at the same time, but are not necessarily causing each other. So this could be positive, meaning like when A goes up, B goes up. When the temperature goes up, people sweat more. Or it could be negative. When the temperature goes up, people wear less sweaters. So negative correlation would be between temperature and sweaters. Positive correlation would be between temperature and sweat. We're not saying that the sweat caused the temperature or the temperature caused the sweat or vice versa. We're just saying they move together. Causation would be if we said it is the temperature that is causing the sweat and not the other way around. Me sweating cannot make the temperature go up. Although if we're in a small enough room, I guess it could. But we're saying which one of them is causing the other, and is there any causal relationship at all? It could be that the two things are being caused by something else. Right? So trying to identify the causal link, its direction and its magnitude, and exactly the sequencing, that's the main preoccupation, I would say, of applied microeconomists and a lot of macroeconomists too. So they want to understand exactly if interest rates and economic activity are moving together, what is exactly the link between the Fed changing the interest rate by 0.25 and GDP? Not reverse causation, but direct causation, okay? So when people are trying to say that something is causal and it's not, we call it endogeneity bias. And it's, like I said, my favorite and least favorite part of being an economist. Because if you go to an economic conference, 9 times out of 10, someone in the back of the room will be like, but isn't that endogenous? Haven't you not truly considered that the causal link you are positing could be being driven by this other variable that I randomly pulled out of my butt? And economists are just like wonderful at doing that. And I do think it's a weird, warped way of using your brain that I've come to enjoy. And it means that you can study a lot of different interesting problems if you can prove that you're getting at causality better than anyone else, but it is something you have to be constantly stressing about. So there are 3 main reasons why you might see A and B moving together, but there's not actually any causal link between them. The first one is coincidence. I think your textbook talks about like the AFC wins the Super Bowl and the stock market plummets. It's this correlation we see year after year, but there's no reason to think that it's causal. Like Puxatawny Phil and groundhogs seeing their shadow, not really a causal link, mostly coincidence. If you wear a lucky jersey and your team wins, I think that's most likely truly just a coincidence. You know, people can be very, have very firm beliefs about how they're causing their team to win. But I think it's very different when the jersey's on a fan versus on a player. So a lucky jersey on a player is more likely to be an omitted variable. So this is a variable that's not A or B, but it's C. And when C goes up, it's actually causing A and B to go up. So I would argue that when the player wears the lucky jersey, there's this omitted variable of confidence. The player's confidence going up is actually causing the win. It's not the lucky jersey, it's the lucky jersey causing the confidence. So hopefully that makes sense to you. The difference between coincidence and omitted variables depends on who the jersey is on. Another example of omitted variables from your textbook is like people used to think that if you ate ice cream, you would get polio. Turns out that the omitted variable was just summertime, made you be in more close proximity to people and more likely to get polio and also more likely to eat ice cream. There's also a big omitted variable in the research that I do. So I'm going to keep telling you about my research because it's what I think about when I'm not thinking about you guys. But I told you that I study salmon permits and what happens when somebody sells one. It turns out that they're more likely to leave the village. So like salmon permits being sold, it doesn't look like it says sold, makes you more likely to leave the village. But there's this big omitted variable, like your attachment to the village. That's going to make you more likely to leave and also more likely to sell. So a big part of the contribution of my paper is trying to isolate the part of leaving that is really driven by the permit and not by your attachment to the village. So I do that a couple different ways. One of them, TMI. We can talk about it individually if you're curious. Okay, so that's omitted variables. Hopefully you can think of some examples of omitted variables on your own. Reverse causation is a very specific situation where it's not that the sweat is causing the sunshine, it's that the sunshine is causing the sweat or something similar to that. So if you always see raincoats and then you see rain, you might think that whenever you put your raincoat on, you're going to cause it to rain. That's like a 3-year-old's thinking. But it's not that, it's actually the rain causing the raincoats. It's the other way around. One of my favorite examples of reverse causation, and a lot of times this will happen when two variables are very linked, like poverty and violence. So there's a lot of opinions that the poorer you are, the more desperate you are, the more likely you are to use instrumental violence to be able to get your basic needs met. But we also know that violence is going to cause businesses to relocate, people to move out of an area. It's going to perpetuate this cycle of poverty and violence that communities can get trapped in. So if an economist is interested in isolating the part of violence that's caused by poverty, they want to find what we call an instrumental variable, something that's going to be really highly correlated with poverty, but not correlated with violence necessarily. One that we use in development economics a lot is rainfall. So in agricultural economies, rainfall is really going to drive poverty. So if you just look at how the rain affects violence, you're going to pick up on the part of violence that's being driven by poverty, and you're going to kind of break the reverberating chain and not have the reverse causation matter as much, because most people aren't driven to violence just by it raining. So one of the strangest papers I've ever read is, if it's actually really good, is a paper called Poverty and Witch Killing, and it's using rainfall shocks in areas of, I believe, Kenya, to look at what part of violence against older women is driven instrumentally by poverty and what part of it is driven by prejudice. So that's my favorite part about being an economist. Let's check and see whether you understand it. So I'm going to walk you through these examples, and then I'm going to give you one of your own. So here I'm going to give you a correlation, and you're going to tell me whether you think there's causation, and if there's not, whether it's due to coincidence, omitted variable, or reverse causation. So if I tell you that how much education you get and your future earnings are positively correlated, we talked about that in the last video. We talked about the opportunity cost of college. Do you think that's true causation, coincidence, omitted variable, or reverse causation? Just pause for a second. Think about whether you think that. Which of those you think is going on? I hope, for your sakes, right, we're all in the business of education, that there's some true causation. But it's not all your education. So people who go to college make more money. There's also this big omitted variable that labor economists try to measure called ability. So people that are higher ability, maybe they just have like a really charismatic personality, maybe they're just really driven to work hard. All of those people are going to get more education because they're going to get more positive reinforcement from their teachers when they're young, and they're going to be able to focus more on their schoolwork in college, and they're going to get more education. Those people would also earn more in the workforce even if they didn't have the education, right? When you're on the job, your ability matters, your ability to be charismatic, all these intangible things that are kind of hard to measure, like your work effort and your personality. Those things are going to make your earnings go up regardless of your education. So we might falsely attribute some of the impact of education to ability. So labor economists do all kinds of creative things to try and isolate those. They do a lot of studies with twins. They love to find twins, and like presumably they have a lot of the same genetic abilities. And so if they get different amounts of education, you can compare them. They'll also do things like compare people who fall just on either side of an age cutoff for education and compare their life outcomes. All kinds of ways. Shoe size and reading comprehension. You know what they say about the bigger the feet, the better you read. Right? Do you think those are actually causal, or is there something going on there? I think there is probably just a coincidence, or if there is really a correlation there, it could be the omitted variable of like age. So a 5-year-old is not going to be able to read as well as a 12-year-old, and they're also going to have smaller feet. And then also, as we think about this in adults, a lot of times, if you are severely malnourished as a child, you can end up smaller, and you are also going to have some impacts on your reading comprehension probably. So when you first think about it, maybe you thought just pure coincidence, or maybe you were thinking about these age and nutrition effects. What about baby booms and minivans? You know what they say, the second you see a sweet minivan, boom, you're pregnant. That's pretty easy, right? Reverse causation. The minivan comes to the market and not vice versa. So the market for high quality minivans is driven by the baby boom and probably not the other way around. Most people don't wait to have a baby until they see a sweet minivan. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Now I'm going to give you one example to do on your own. And this one, I like to give you last year's exam questions. You can see how it actually asks this on an exam. Probably won't be giving you many multiple choice questions on your take-home exam. Those are just too easy to cheat on. But this is like a more complicated correlation causation question. So please take a second, pause, do this one on your own, and you'll see the results when you're done. Okay, the last tool we're going to talk about is models. Now, I had a really disgusting TA. When you start a PhD program in economics, you do this thing called math camp, and my math camp TA was a douche and walked in the first day with a big shirt that said, "Economists do it with models." And we're all like, yeah, get it. He proceeded to try and sleep with all of the female students in his class. Not a good guy. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about models as in a set of simplifying assumptions. So a model has simplifying assumptions. We're going to view the world, boil down all of its complexity to 2 dimensions a lot of the time. It's going to feel weird. And we do that so we can make predictions. So I think the easiest way to tell you what I mean when I say model is to show you one. So here's an example of a model from macroeconomics. I guess it has micro foundations, but macroeconomists use it more. This is called the circular flow model. So in this model, we assume there's only 2 entities, households and firms. There's 2 markets where they interact, the factors of production market and the market for goods and services. And all of the goods and services are flowing in purple. The firms make all the goods and services. The households buy them all. And in return, the households supply land, labor, and capital. We assume that the households own all of the means of production. They own all the land, all the labor, and all the machinery, tools, things to make goods and services. And they sell them to the firms. The firms buy those and use them to make the goods and services. So that's how the physical things are moving throughout the economy in purple. Then there's money that's flowing in blue. The firms provide wages in return for labor, rent in return for land, and profit in return for capital. And the households take that as income. They spend all their income in the market for goods and services, and the firms take it all in as revenue. Nothing leaks outside of this circular flow. So you don't need to know this model and use it. What I want you to do is to use this model to identify what is the difference between an assumption and a prediction. So there were a lot of assumptions in the circular flow model. The first one we made was that only firms and households, right? No government, no people that own their own businesses, and no saving and no taxes. So those are some of the first complications people will make to that model, is add in saving and taxes. We also assume that households own all the means of production, right? There's no firms that own any machines or any land. So one thing that this model would predict is, sure, yeah, you can raise wages. The only thing that will happen is that firms will see more revenue. So they're not actually harmed by paying their workers more, because the only thing households can do with those new wages is to spend them all in the market for goods and services. So it goes right back to the firm. So that's an example of a model. And I want you to really focus on the difference between assumption and prediction. Thanks, guys. That's the end of the chapter 1 material. Hopefully this gave you like a gentle introduction to how video lectures will work, some of the perks and cons. It would be great if for Monday you came prepared with a couple of clarifying questions. What are the things you're confused about? Any constructive feedback that you think I could handle? If you want to see a different background, more high quality webcam. I will see you on Monday on Zoom, and I hope you really enjoy your first weekend of the semester. Maybe I'll spy some of you at the fireworks tonight.